today's forum is that we created a case study. We can't show all the riparian areas that the Parks Board is working on. So this was a particularly nice one to provide an opportunity for you all to see where some of these large-scale tree planting efforts are taking place, and some of the aspects of how that works and how they're doing it and why they're doing it the way they're doing it and that kind of thing. The video itself will run about 10 minutes, and what we're going to do is go ahead and show the video first. I've been giving time for more folks to come online, and then once we do that, Marissa and I will come back on, and she will take a question, and we'll do Q&A with everybody, which is fun. That went really well with the last forum, and then we will take the whole package of today and we will have it on our website available for people to view. They are videos that will in fact also be available, and links will be provided in the manual itself once that's created. So with that, the other thing I'll mention is that you can put in questions in the Q&A section while the video is going on, or obviously during the Q&A portion itself. And I think that covers anything else. Did I miss anything, Marissa?
So I think you covered everything.
All right, good. Okay, well then we're off and running. We'll start the video. Thanks again, everybody, for attending.
This is one of our beautiful parks that we have recently completed, our Bayou Greenway Trail. And so the trail is actually open and available for usage. We are actively working on several components of conservation-related projects here at the park, which include reforestation, which is this whole section over here. We'll be looking at riparian restoration. We do actually have planned a prairie section that we'll be restoring and looking at other freshwater wetland systems that we'll be creating and putting back into this park as to kind of naturalize it and go back to more of a natural setting. A lot of our parklands have forested edges, and we knew we needed to go in there, remove the invasives like waxleaf ligustrum, privet, and Chinese tallow, take that stuff out, and then put the good stuff back in. And we also knew that there would be instances of wetland habitats that needed to be restored. And of course our grasslands definitely needed to be rethought and then also restored as well. All of those aspects kind of factored into our overall vision of trying to address the conservation needs of the land for which we're responsible for. The land that we maintain, the land that we own, and trying to move forward and thinking of it and have parkland be amenable to the park users, very much attractive to them, like coming out and seeing a space that they want to enjoy, but then also a space that is also this buffer for the native wildlife. Greens Bayou still remains really natural. It's very much naturalized and doesn't have the same kind of industrial development or channelization that you see in other bayou systems within the city of Houston. So for that reason, one of our really important goals in looking at kind of our role here in Greens Bayou, since we own several parcels along the streamway, is to consider maintaining that natural ribbon, that natural soft edge along Greens Bayou. And so here at Thomas Bell Foster, again, doing that restoration and doing the riparian area and restoring it with all native trees that are endemic to this area, but then also are typically adapted for inundation conditions, time periods when they get wet and time periods when it's supposed to be dry. Used to that, adapted to those conditions. It's really important for us to kind of maintain that level of keeping the land as soft and natural and adjacent to Greens Bayou.
So we actually have planted 375 trees, partially along partially along Greens Bayou. down to the water for riparian restoration purposes, and an additional 100 or so trees in another location that had replaced some invasive vegetation.
We utilized the native tree list that was available through the Houston Parks and Recreation Department, and also some recommendations from Texas Parks and Wildlife. So we kind of put that information together, so our tree selection really reflects those species and the ones that we would find. This park actually regularly floods. So it flooded during Harvey, it flooded during Memorial Day flood, tax day flood, Imelda. This park goes underwater. But it's resilient enough to be able to handle those situations, those events in the spectrum of time, and then be able to bounce back in the way it needs to bounce back and still do really well and still provide the services. So restoring the riparian zone, restoring open grassland, all of that, we do that with the thought of being able to make it resilient as well, to be able to kind of bounce back from those events that we know are going to happen in and along this area as part of just our normal weather and what we're all used to here in the city of Houston. A really big one with our trails is access to our waterways and to our natural areas, and providing, especially given the times that we are in now with people having to deal with COVID-19, being able to come outside, being able to walk around and run, or just literally get out of their house to just have a mental break, provides health benefits that we could account for.
We specifically have been doing restoration down the slope that originally had been cleared by the people that had lived here before, because this park was initially a residential area. And after Hurricane Harvey, the homes were pretty badly damaged, and the different segments were divided up, and residential houses are no longer going to be built here.
We've chosen species like loblolly pine, and then of course beautiful red maple that we have as part of this particular restoration work that we've done here along the riparian edge at Greens. But we might choose other types of species like other nut-all oaks or different kinds of oaks in and along Sims Bayou. So there's a lot of that has to kind of be planned out and thought out very, very carefully. We were lucky enough to work with the Houston Parks and Recreation Department and be able to utilize some of their trees in particular settings in other locations. But we're also trying to kind of, identify vendors that would have these species that we want, these desired native species that are adapted to our region.
So this site is actually a riparian corridor between Strickland Park and what used to be Texaco Golf Course. Texaco Golf Course is being transformed right now into some sort of park that we will connect through this area to Strickland with the trail.
There's tons of different species and diversity out here. It used to be a privet and ligustrum forest, and it was cleared of those invasive species, being mindful of the native trees that were here and implementing different species to help with wildlife diversity and ecology diversity as well.
Right behind me you see a recently cleared area that we have planted 1,200 trees in 2021, and we have planted an additional 1,000 trees with a collaboration with HPARD at Strickland Park and with collaboration with Trees for Houston. They donated over 1,000 trees to help us replant this entire area. It's ongoing. We are going to be clearing additional acres because this corridor goes all the way back along an estuary that flows into Greens Bayou. And we're gonna have to be keeping an eye out and continuously treating and maintaining the area, because privet and ligustrum will come back and outcompete the saplings we planted. So our protocols are to monitor the site continuously and cut back and re-clear these areas to allow this forest and this riparian zone to reestablish itself to what it used to be.
It's really good for future diversity to bring in different tree species and different plant species to help bring different birds and insects and wildlife in general to have a more diverse environment for them. So we have to be mindful of that. We have educational signs out to kind of explain what's going on here and what we're doing and why. And anytime someone stops us, you know, we let them know what's going on and give them a little insight of why we're doing what we're doing. There's a lot of wildlife diversity between feral hogs every once in a while. There's a lot of reptiles and amphibians that live along the shoreline and in the forest itself, but also it maintains bird diversity. We see a few species here, but obviously we'd like to grow that number and have a more diverse impact here. And so hopefully with the reforestation and riparian repair, we can keep the shoreline from eroding to maintain the habitat that's already here while implementing new habitat for birds and other wildlife species.
By planting with native trees in Houston, it benefits the native wildlife a lot more than an ecosystem that consists of basically 2 non-native species and a couple native species that happen to be able to compete with those invasives. It also helps deter flooding, and it helps clean the water by soaking up any chemicals and heavy metals that are in the water. So it actually helps create a cleaner bayou and cleaner drinking water for you while benefiting wildlife as well. We have a trail right now and a kayak launch at Strickland Park, and that trail will continue through this area and then through what used to be the old golf course. So eventually this will be opened up for the public to enjoy and walk through, and it will connect parks and additional trails together to continue connecting Houston to green spaces.
Okay, great. That was awesome. Let me, I know Marissa's gonna get back on here. Okay, and thanks for everyone that's called in. This is fabulous. What a great audience. I really appreciate it. That's great. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. I've already got a series here, so I'm gonna start with those, but there, you know, if you have other follow-up thoughts, we're glad to you know, answer as many of them as we can. We will wrap this up, at least based on the other forum. The goal is to wrap up around 10:30, 10:40. You know, if we just really have a huge number, we'll go a little bit longer, but we do plan to wrap it up generally around 10:15. So, Marissa, why don't you introduce yourself a little more to everybody? And I know there's some other staff members who were on the video. You might introduce them as well. Okay.
I'm glad you mentioned that. So, so I'm Marissa Yosa. I'm the conservation manager for the Houston Parks Board, and the video actually showcased the rest of the conservation team with our group. So the gentleman was Patrick Kelleher, who is one of our conservation technicians working with our group, and then you also had a chance to see Alexis Overdeek, who is our other conservation technician, part of our team. So we are a strong and gallant team of 3, which is awesome because it's been really great working with these 2 very energized people to accomplish our conservation goals. So I think that kind of, you know, unless there's something else you want me to talk about with the conservation program in general.
Well, it may very well come out in the Q&A. So if it doesn't, then yeah, we can certainly do that. So just in terms, since this is a case study, I think it would be interesting for people to know if you ran into any obstacles during this restoration process or with the large scale tree planting itself.
So one of our obstacles, at least initially, was identifying a vendor who had a significant number of native species. So that's kind of our one of our biggest obstacles. Now, we have worked with HPARD, Kelly Andrasic over at HPARD, who's amazing there, and I know she has her nursery, but her trees are spoken for, you know, so and she has many projects online that, you know, for which those trees are obligated. And so it meant that we had to identify other sources. So we were able to identify a resource that was actually from a recommendation from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and we were able to get the species that we wanted, but they're not always available. And then they're also not necessarily available in the quantities that we would like. We'd like to see
Right.
more. So that was one of the big ones that we had to face.
Well, and I would say, certainly when the Tree Strategy Implementation Group, or TSIG as we call ourselves, which is made up of all the major tree planters and planters to a large extent in the region, or many of them, including TxDOT and the Parks Board and the City of Houston, Harris County, and the Flood Control District. Everybody across the board has said that the availability of native trees at this scale, which currently the data from TSIG shows that about 210,000 trees are planted annually. And that, of course, is on the rise. But in order to be able to reach 4.6 million by 2030, we're looking at 450,000. So almost doubling the amount, or doubling the amount of trees planted every year. And so that means a tremendous amount of tree availability. And I know that that's part of a part of the strategy is to talk with tree farmers, many of which are now aware of this initiative and are trying to look at a significant increase in the amount of different native trees. And then, of course, also, we don't want to have, as was mentioned in the video, we don't want to have one or two species. We want to have that diversity of the multiple species, of which the region is so fortunate to have so many species to choose from, which is fabulous and different. And we now know also that different tree species have different ecosystem services. And so you can target different species depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And in fact, in that regard, how did you decide what species you decided to plant along Greens Bayou?
So because we were focusing initially, it's specifically at Thomas Bell Foster, which was showcased in the video, we were focusing on the riparian zone. We had been discussing that work with, again, Kelly Andrasik at Houston Parks and Recreation Department as part of her larger effort. She's been doing riparian restoration for a while in many city parks, and she has a very ambitious plan. So we kind of tapped into her knowledge about species lists and what specific species that were part of her list for her riparian restoration. So we integrated that. And then we had also consulted separately with Texas Parks and Wildlife, the urban wildlife biologists that are for this region, in trying to kind of identify specific species that would be appropriate for our restoration at Cool Green. So that was the second half of the video, was on the other site at Cool Green Corridor. So we definitely tapped into those resources to make sure that we were introducing the right species in the right locations. And then it was the going through the process of then identifying a vendor and then purchasing the trees. But yeah, so we did not do this inside, our own little silo. We brought in partners to kind of give us the insight, especially their experience, to help us guide the right decisions and the right trees in the right location.
That's great. And the manual that I mentioned, and I know some folks have joined us since the introduction, the Tree Strategy Implementation Group's goal or objectives, I guess I should say, is to help the city implement the 4.6 million trees by 2030. And to do that, how do all these major tree planters and those that may want to plant large scale amounts of trees, or even just a few trees, I mean, it all counts. How do we go about doing that in a way that will get us where we need to be? And so part of that is this TSIG manual that we're putting together that will help it, whether it's an organization or individuals. And really, I think it'll help everybody, because it'll be nice to have it in one place, which we don't have right now, as you're kind of pointing out. If you want to do a large scale tree planting, or maybe you want to shake it up a little bit, maybe you've been doing them, but you've been kind of using the same species, and you'd like to look at those metrics that we now have, and how different trees can provide carbon sequestration, air pollution absorption, water quality enhancement. So erosion control. There's so many different aspects of what our different tree species can do. And that is part of what this manual will try to accomplish, is provide some of that kind of opportunity in some pretty specific detail, but not in so much detail that it's gigantic. And so that's going to be the challenge for us, but I think we can do it. One of the things that we got a question on was, when will that manual be completed? Our goal is the summer of 2021 to have that. We're about, I would say we're probably 50% into the manual currently. And I know there's some of the TSIG members present today, and I really want to give a shout out to all of them. And you can see that on our website. With the kickoff one pager shows many of those TSIG members. There's been a few that have been added since the November 6th, but I really appreciate all the time commitment that the TSIG members are giving to this effort. And of course, it's going to be, transformative for the region to have so many more additional trees added to our region. And we've got so many different places to do that, which is so exciting. One of the other questions I got was, how will the native trees and grasses be maintained over the next few years?
That's a great question, because maintenance is many times overlooked, and you do actually have to implement a pretty strategic maintenance plan to keep the trees growing properly, but then also to kind of keep the area from being overtaken by whatever else might try and encroach the area. So we actually have contractors that work to maintain our existing trails, but we also have a contractor that works with us to maintain our conservation areas. And so one of their maintenance protocols will be to go into the areas that we have restored, like we showcased again at Thomas Bell Foster, that riparian section. They will go in on a regular basis and they will cut down, like just literally cut down the giant ragweed or other species that will try and encroach that area. And this will allow for the smaller trees to kind of really get their that initial growth and then grow up and over what would normally be they're possibly being shaded out by the giant ragweed. So it will be, at least on the beginning, at the very, very forefront, it will be a lot of maintenance, because we'll have to cut back fairly often, like probably quarterly. I don't know at this point, but we do have, not only do we have the contractors who do that work for us, but we also have staff that actually have a routine protocol for checking on these areas. So we have a protocol that will allow us to make sure that we're keeping an eye on it. And I apologize, I live right by Ellington, so give me a minute.
I figured that must be on your end, but I was like, my goodness. Yeah.
I always have to let them, they do exercises fairly regularly, so I think this, okay, sounds like they're moving on. Anyway, so as part of our protocol, we'll be looking at these sites fairly often and then making notes. And then if we notice that the giant ragweed has reached a point where it's overtopping our planted trees, then we contact and then implement a cycle of maintenance. So then our contractor would come in and cut that down, and then that would allow for the trees to get the proper sunlight and all the other components that they need for proper growth. So we expect that it will be high maintenance for a little while, but it won't be that way for 10 years. It'll be that way just at the beginning. So
got it. And I know that that's been a challenge, as various TSIG members have talked about. That is a challenge, for everybody in the region, to a large extent, because we do have so many invasive grasses, yes, non-native grasses. And so you really have to keep those back in order to give those trees an opportunity. If we, one of the things that I know other some organizations are working on, the Parks Board included, and that's Harris County Flood Control District and other nonprofit partners, are working on ways to create native grass seed that you could bring in, and that could begin to establish and keep a lot of those other invasives and non-natives at bay, so there wouldn't be so much maintenance. But right now, that's kind of where we are. And so that'll be talked about in the manual as well, different aspects of maintenance. Would you say that generally, though, after about 2 years of that, those things, that's been, I know, generally the rule of thumb in the Houston region is you make sure they're watered on, well, either through natural ways or through enhancements or irrigation, and then keep those weeds at bay. And then they're kind of good to go after about a couple of years. Has that been your experience?
Yes, yes. 2 years I think is what we have right now for the watering cycle, and we do actually have we do have a pretty intensive watering protocol as well to make sure that we don't lose our trees. So it's not just the maintenance and keeping the invasive grasses or other emergent plants, kind of keeping that down, but it's also the watering component as well. So all of that's wrapped into what we would implement as part of our maintenance and watching of these sites. And 2 years after that, then everything kind of falls off a little bit after that. So, and actually, I wanted to kind of interject. You had mentioned putting in grass seed. So that's actually another component of what we're doing is right now we're kind of doing a little bit of mulching of the area immediately around the trees to just kind of make it easier for our contractors to know, hey, this is the tree that we planted. Because, you know, sometimes it can be a problem. But so we did that, but we're also looking at, you know, putting in more understory species that are native, and then also considering grasses. So in other scenarios and other locations, we would be putting in native grass seed, because you're absolutely right. Otherwise, you'll have these trees, but then the KR blue stem will do the same thing that the giant ragweed will do. It'll grow up so tall and it'll overtop and overshade the little trees.
Little trees, and once they get going, they do pretty well. But you got to help them out a bit in the beginning. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about the soil preparation. That's going to also be a part of the TSIG manual. Is, you know, we're learning more and more, particularly after Hurricane Harvey, that our soils are phenomenally capable, because they're so clay based, of protecting and providing the nutrients necessary for our native trees, but the soils have to be in a shape that allow for those nutrients and the trees to get those nutrients as they need them. So what did you all do there in terms of soil? Did you need to do much? Or
actually, for our site at Thomas Bell Foster and even on the edge at Cool Green, we did not do any kind of soil amendment for those particular sites, because they're right there on the edge in the rain zone. It's something at this point that I think we will be making notes. If we see that we're not having this kind of success rates that we wanted, then that would be an indicator for us to kind of go back and then reevaluate that particular protocol. But at this point, we didn't necessarily do that, because we knew, one, that we weren't putting the trees into soil, like, you know, soil that had been like construction type. It's not one of those scenarios. More was it excavated out into, you know, solid clay, like you would see in other scenarios, like in a detention basin, for example.
Right, or along the freeways. I know TxDOT has run into that, and that they have to prep the soil. Yeah.
Right. It's different because our locations are different. So we didn't feel that was necessary at this point. Now we could be, again, we may need to evaluate that down the road, but at this point we just proceeded this way.
Right. Well, and that is true what you said. You know, the riparian areas were traditionally forested, even if the surrounding areas might be more prairie based. Generally, all of our riparian corridors generally had various types of native trees, and still do. And so one would think that there probably is still a pretty good soil network that exists along that area. So let's hope, right, that you don't have to do too much soil prep in that regard. One of the things that's come up, we're going to go a little bit to a bigger scale, and that is, you know, as we look at adding all these trees, you know, the roughly 210 to 230,000 trees that are currently being planted in our region annually, and doubling that to somewhere around 430 to 450,000 trees. If we are adding trees over here and we're removing trees over here, that is not a good thing, right? So if we can, to the extent we cannot remove trees, and I know that many of the master plan communities today work very hard to that are being built today work very hard to not remove trees, but in fact, build communities around existing trees, and then they add in many thousands of trees. In fact, that 210,000 number, our data, a lot of those trees come from developers who are now often many times have their own tree farms, and they're putting in lots of native trees, which is good. But we do recognize, so in kind of an answer to that question that was asked, the TSIG recognizes that we need to have an idea of how many trees are being removed a year, and do what we can to advocate that those tree removals not take place if possible, if there's a way to avoid large-scale tree removal while we're at the midst of trying to do large-scale tree planting. We don't have that data yet. We're hoping to get it. We're kind of working through how to systematically come find that data. So if anyone on this call, of which there are many folks, have a way to do that, or think you have a way, please email me at deborah@houstonwilderness.org. The TSIG members have been talking about this the last couple of meetings about how we might go about getting that data, and we're contemplating even bringing in perhaps a graduate level intern to actually create a study around it, who can actually concentrate full time on figuring out how we do that. Maybe it's through permit requests. We're just not sure, but that we recognize that's important, and we do plan to incorporate that to the extent possible into what we're doing, so that because we recognize that that's something we need to keep an eye on. I think part of that question also was how many the trees are desired for the TSIG, and I've kind of already answered that we're looking at probably 450,000 a year in order to be able to reach that 4.6 million by 2030, and that's really a quilt, if you will, of different ways that happens. So you've got the existing large-scale tree planters, and part of our TSIG membership, I haven't named everybody on there, but you can see it on our website. But we do have the major, of course, tree planting nonprofits, including Trees for Houston. And then we also have some of the major landscape architects who work with many of the developers and corporate entities, et cetera, who are very interested in this effort and want to be a part of increasing the number of trees. So, and then we also recognize that residents want to be a part of this effort. And so we're trying to find ways that we can increase the number of residential plantings in the community, and that all of that is what it's going to take to be able to reach this gigantic number. So another question is, do the lands next to Greens Bayou flood regularly, and if yes, how frequently? And I think there's a caveat to that while I mention it, and that is, if that's true, how do you think these species will fare in those floodwaters?
So we specifically picked species that were adapted to the riparian conditions. So most of these trees are wet or facultative wet species that have that capacity. So that was the first part of it. And then to answer the question about the flooding, it does flood. This park does go underwater. Like I said in the video, all the major events that we've had in Houston for the last couple of years, Tax Day flood, Memorial Day flood, Imelda, all of those events, this park was underwater. And the thing about it is the park is extremely resilient. So everything has kind of, I guess I can use one specific example. So there's a cherry laurel tree that kind of is present along different sections at Thomas Bell Foster, and have been there for quite some time, and they just do really, really well. And I know for a fact that these trees were underwater for the days on end in each one of those events. Now, how often does Greens Bayou flood? It has on the very eastern edge of the property. Yes, I believe it's the very eastern edge of the property. There's a the most low-lying area, and there's a wetland that's existing right there. And that wetland has a tidal influence. So there is, a daily regime of inundation and drying out period for that section, but not all of the park experiences that. But along the riparian edge, you'll see that the level of Greens Bayou goes up and down pretty regularly. Now, in terms of full flooding for the park, it's different. That might actually be that might change differently. And so I'd have to go back and check the records to see myself how often it floods. But we did consider that when we selected the species that we selected for that particular site. And the same goes true for Cool Green, which is further up Greens Bayou. There were ones, there was a section of Cool Green that was very, very low, that could easily be inundated by Greens Bayou as it kind of rises during flood events. And so we selected much wetter species for that particular location. But then as you moved further away and a little bit higher, we started to change the palette to make it, a species group that would be able to be, would be more tolerant of drier conditions.
Well, that makes sense. So here's an interesting question that's come up, and I'm just going to kind of read it. It's got two questions in there, I think. We have talked a bit about TxDOT, and in fact, I know there's a TxDOT attendee, someone with TxDOT attending today. If he would like to answer beyond my answer to this question, feel free. But it says, you mentioned TxDOT, who does massive tree plantings that look amazing, which I would agree with that. The sycamore have really done well this year. It says, are we working with them to plant more natives versus non-natives or invasives? And the answer is yes. They are part of the TSIG group. I'm very actively involved. It says, I know their mix of trees sometimes includes crepe myrtle and other non-natives. And then also he asks, do you know if there have been any studies or information on their plantings over time to show fill in mature and or habitats that have been created? And I will answer what I know, and then if Ethan with TxDOT would like to mention more, I welcome the opportunity. But we're actually going to be highlighting, along with other case studies such as the Parks Board's work, TxDOT and what they're doing. They do phenomenal job of turning often those sides of the freeway that have not the best of soil into areas that really allow for trees to mature and grow into large, beautiful species. I also know that they work very hard to plant natives. They have planted crepe myrtles, which are popular in this region. If you had a chance to tune in, or you can see it on our website, the forum that we did in October with the Parks Board, with the Houston Parks Department, they're actually trying to encourage reduction of crepe myrtle since it's not native, and it just doesn't really give our migratory birds or other wildlife much in the way of nutrition the way our native trees do, nor do they have the same amount of ecosystem services provided to the region. And so there is an effort to reduce those generally. But Ethan, why don't I let you say a few additional words about all the great things TxDOT's doing with tree planting.
So thank you, Deborah, and thanks, Marissa, for this great presentation today. I think everybody's doing a great job. And thanks for the question. The tree species that we plant are probably 90% or more native materials. Yes, we do use crepe myrtles. We do have some oleanders that we use. But as far as the elms, pines, oaks, sycamore, the vast majority of the trees that we plant are natives. We do use the crepe myrtles because we do need some color out there along the edge of our plantings as the large masses get a little bit larger. And we have experimented with quite a few of the natives. And we run into different issues with them for various reasons, whether it be the construction soils or availability or just other challenges that we might have. And that's a greater discussion for another day. But we do experiment all the time with a variety of materials. As far as the habitat question, our goal for planting along the roadsides is not for habitat. I don't think that was probably a safe or an appropriate use of that space is for habitat next to the freeways. We do it mainly for aesthetic purposes, reduce mowing, reduce maintenance, a lot of other good beneficial purposes. And so if there are some habitat improvements, those are going to be just side benefits. It's not our main focus. Thanks.
Right. Although I will say, and Ethan, you can pipe in here, but I'm sure that our migratory birds are using those trees. They don't care where they are. But in terms of other types of wildlife, certainly not. But you know, when I'm passing by those trees on the freeway, I'm not stopping usually long enough to see whether or not there's birds using those trees, but I'm sure they must be.
Especially in a lot of our detention pond facilities. We have
Yeah.
hundreds of those around the region, and there are a lot of variety of critters taking advantage of those green spaces.
Yeah, no, that's great. But that is an interesting question. And over time, it would be nice to do some research on different areas of our region in terms of the habitat, you know, what that habitat does in terms of, even though I know that TxDOT's not trying not to create habitat, I want to make that clear. That's, you know, certainly not your number one objective. It's to get people from A to B. But because they are there, and because we know what kind of opportunity they provide to our region, not just for ecosystem services, but certainly as habitat for a variety of different wildlife and avian species. It would be interesting to do a study on that, a little bit of a before and after, but that's, you know, for a different forum. I also want to mention that TxDOT will be hosting a forum later this spring, or maybe into the early summer. You all will get, there'll be emails, of course, sent out about that, but they'll be doing one as well. And the next one we have after this one is actually with the Texas Forest Service to talk about invasives and tree stressors such as diseases that are occurring in our region. That will be a good one that we'll be doing in March. You all will get information on that as well. I thought I might bring up a few specific ecosystem services, Marissa, as we kind of wrap up this forum. I'll say it looks like we're getting a few more questions. In terms of erosion control or other ecosystem services, what do you think you all will see that might be different than what's happening now? I mean, are you thinking that might actually help hold the soil along the riparian corridor areas, or what do you think?
Yes, that is one of the big targeted goals, is erosion control over time. So we acknowledge that, you know, in the immediate removal of the species and that time, the lag time between the trees that were there and the trees that we have put into the system now, there will be some transition there, but the goal was to long-term provide erosion control for that shoreline edge, because we know that it functions that way. We actually saw it in a different section at Thomas Bell Foster. So that's actually a very important goal of ours, not only to restore the habitat, like we discussed, for the native wildlife that still utilize that part there in and out, because there's very much a soft edge. And then the whole edge actually is still pretty soft, except for the one little section at the very, very end. So providing those wildlife benefits, but then also having that erosion control benefit is very important to us. So very much one of the ecosystem services that we considered. And Deborah, I did notice in the chat that somebody asked about Trees for Houston, and I do want to interject that yes, they did work with us at Thomas Bell Foster. They provided a large number of those trees as part of the planting for this year, and so we have worked with them for that location and several other locations. So we have worked with them, and then, you know, of course, what they provide are the native ones that we would utilize in this area anyway. So they have a great palette that to select from as well. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, that's right. And I remember hearing that in the video too, which is great. That and Trees for Houston, I know, provides trees to different entities and individuals all over the region, which is fabulous. So another question I've gotten is, how many businesses and corporations help with this initiative, and do we have any corporate campus examples that we can share? And so the answer to both of those is yes. In fact, we've had a very strong corporate involvement, and we encourage as many as would like to be involved in this effort. You can email me at deborah@houstonwilderness.org, and I'll connect you with those pieces. In fact, at the November 6th kickoff for Arbor Day, we actually did it in conjunction with a large-scale tree planting at a park along Buffalo Bayou Park. That's another one of our partners is on the TSIG is Buffalo Bayou Partnership. And we planted several hundred trees, and we had 4 corporate volunteer groups for that effort, which was great. Very, of course, social distance. And we followed COVID protocols, but that's not hard to do with large-scale tree planting. But then also, we have a lot of corporations and corporate campuses that have green space to do large-scale tree planting and are very interested in doing it. And some of the examples that we have talked about, and I'll tell you what, since I'm having questions like that, I will include a slide presentation on that webpage under our HoustonWilderness.org website. Click under programs. There's a 4.6 million tree goal option. Click on that. I'll include our slide presentation because we actually do show corporate examples and master plan community examples of large-scale tree planting. The Shell campus in West Houston has an incredible example of that you can really see from the street. At Derry Ashford and I-10. It's just absolutely beautiful. And then the ConocoPhillips campus, there's lots of, I'm going to leave out lots of amazing corporate examples, but there are examples of that. And we will include in the manual, corporate opportunities and what those kind of large scale tree plantings might look like. And then we're, again, we can't make this effort happen without a quilt of, if you will, of different partners doing different aspects of tree planting. And so part of that is going to have to be in corporate involvement as well as developer involvement as well. And then I see there's another question, or say, I'd like to give a shout out to Greens Bayou Coalition. Absolutely. Saw that you all had called in and all the work they've done along the bayou, including the native tree plantings at Thomas Bell Park. That's awesome. That's great. The neat thing about this initiative is there's so many partners doing so many amazing things with native trees that I'm definitely leaving out, I suspect, a whole lot of different partners. So thank you for what you're doing in that regard as well. We want to support all those efforts and hopefully provide you all with various tools to be able to continue to increase the amount of native trees that are planted all over the region. I mean, what we like to say a lot at Houston Wilderness, and a lot of folks like to say, is we may not have mountains, we may not have Great Lakes, but what we do have is a phenomenal number of native trees and lots of places to plant them, and they do really well. I've worked with Ethan in the TxDOT Houston district over 20 years ago now. It's hard to believe. When they first started their freeway forestation or green ribbon program effort, and a lot of folks thought that wasn't going to work. That it just needs to stay grass or concrete, but in fact, because we know it works and it works phenomenally well, and that's true all over the region, which is so exciting, and it's really fun to watch the increase and development over the years of more and more understanding and interest in these different tree species. Another thing I want to mention in terms of tree species also is the color issue that Ethan mentioned. And it's true, in the middle of the summer, the crepe myrtle is just a pretty tree. I mean, there's just no doubt about it, even though it's not native. And we have some places where they really are highlighted, in large numbers. But we do also have native trees that are flowering. Interestingly, many of them flower in the wintertime, but there are some that also flower in the summer, and we want to encourage those, and we'll be talking about them in the manual, so that where people want to do a flowering tree, but they really want to go native, there are options, and we want to provide those opportunities for some of that color. And then also there are trees, and red maple is one of them, but there are some other. There's even some oak trees that actually do change color. Their leaves change color during the fall. So you can also look at some of that fall color that you might be looking for, and thinking that we don't have any native trees that do that, but in actuality we do. So that's one thing we're going to really highlight too, is this color palette concept, and encouraging more people to know that what's out there, and then to hopefully be able to work with enough of the tree farmers so that when they do want a certain species because of its different qualities, they'll be able to find it and purchase it. We have let's make this, I guess, the last question. Has there been any tree incentives for developers in the city of Houston to encourage them to plant more trees? Yeah, I think, well, yeah, I mean, there are regulations associated with trees. I know there's an article that was, I think, in the paper over the weekend in San Antonio of some issues they got with people getting exceptions to their tree regulation. But in generally in Houston, in the Houston region, you know, people here are very passionate about their trees. We, you know, organizations such as Trees for Houston and Buffalo Bio Partnership and many others keep a close eye on, in the city of Houston for that matter, people following the tree regulation requirement related to, if you remove a tree, you have to replace it with certain caliber trees, and then also, you know, certain restrictions on removing trees generally, or where trees can be placed in different developments. So those are incentives, but they're regulatory based, so they're more requirements than incentives. But generally, I would say that for a lot of developers in the region, they really don't need much incentives anymore because they already have their own incentives. Their residents want those trees. They recognize their importance for everything from recreation and you know, aesthetics to those ecosystem services associated with water absorption and erosion control. So more often than not, there's an interest in putting as many trees as they can in, as opposed to not wanting to put in the trees. So I'd say, generally for our culture in Houston, we already have pretty strong incentives. But I can also tell you, and I'll shout out a little bit to Marissa Aho, who's the resilience officer at the city of Houston. She's also working closely with the mayor and city council members and other partners to create as many different incentives for the various goals under the Resilient Houston plan as she can. So I guess that pretty much wraps it up. We ended up going over, but what fabulous questions we got. So I sure do appreciate that. Anything else, Marissa, you want to mention as we wrap it up?
No, I think we kind of covered everything. I hope we hit pretty much most of the questions, if not all of them.
Yeah, no, I think we did. Let's see. Okay, let me just mention real quick, if someone could add, we'll add in the Q&A our website, which may have already happened. Let's see. Yeah, we'll make sure that we get the, you know, it's www.houstonwilderness.org, and I can also, we'll put in the Q&A a direct link to that web page as well. So thank you. And again, thanks to everybody. I sure appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great day. What a great turnout of folks. Thank you for spending a little of your time with us, and look out for the next forum that will be in early March, and we'll be getting that out soon with the Texas Forest Service.